thank you all very much for coming to the last in our speaker series for this term for Demystifying Media. Over the course of the term, we've heard from Dennis at International Geographic, from Tracy Powell at Stanford, and last week from Yvonne at Fox. Really interesting speakers, all covering very different topics. And I'm delighted that this week we're joined by Dr. Claire Wardle from Columbia University. Claire is the Research Director for the Tau Center. Before she moved to Tau, she's had an illustrious career in academia and industry and advocacy. She is a phenomenal source of knowledge across a whole range of different issues, ranging from social media to the changing and evolving business and nature of journalism. And when we thought about putting this talk together a couple of months ago, I don't think we knew how topical and kind of apposite this subject was going to be. If you think of the stories that have emerged over the course of the past few weeks about the role that algorithms are playing in shaping our kind of news agenda, if you look at a lot of the kind of big developments in terms of how news is being consumed now across mobile and across social, a lot of those innovations have been driven by tech companies rather than news organizations and media companies. So that's really changing the whole kind of landscape that we are operating in. And some of you will have seen just yesterday the Pew Research Center published their latest data about social media usage here in the States. So we know this is a very fast-moving and evolving space. If Claire was here next week, she'd probably give a completely different talk, because that's how quickly and how dynamic this arena is. So I'm delighted that Claire has been able to fly all the way over from the East Coast to join us and talk today. So please join me in thanking Claire Wardle for joining us.
It's a very kind introduction. So thank you very much for having me on your beautiful campus. It's so green. You have massive trees here. You probably know that, but your trees are massive. So no, it's really lovely to be here. And I'm not going to lie, this is going to be a whistle-stop tour. There is a lot to discuss. I like to talk quickly. But also, we're in a kind of a dark room. So if this was boring, I'd lose you. So, but first of all, who am I and why should I be talking to you about this? This is a fascinating topic. Damien alluded to this, but my interest for the last 6 years has been about how news organizations rely on social media channels for news gathering. So when there's a breaking news event, nowadays, people don't just email the BBC. They simply upload to whichever platform they use most frequently, whether that's Instagram, that they normally upload pictures of cats. If they happen to be in Brussels, they will upload imagery to Instagram. But recently, at the Tau Center over the last 6 months, we've been looking at this relationship between journalism and Silicon Valley from a publication aspect. So how are newsrooms thinking about these platforms from a distribution perspective? So we've interviewed about 70 different journalists from different institutions, talked to lots of people at platforms, and this is a subject, as Damien said, we knew 6 months ago this was important, and it's just becoming more and more important. So in terms of, I'm going to talk about three topics from the platform's perspective, 3 topics from the publisher's perspective. So from the platform's perspective, what is Silicon Valley focused on right now? Secondly, are platforms really publishers? And thirdly, the shifts in audience behavior are utterly startling, and what does that mean? Very quickly, these are fake tweets, because I'm a verification nerd. What's the website that allows you to make fake tweets? LetMeTweetThatForYou.com. So last night in my hotel bedroom, I created this saying at 12 p.m. on the 27th of May, Mark Zuckerberg would tweet this. He hasn't really. They're fake tweets. And then on the other side, I've taken my publishers. So Marty Baron might say, what does this new reality mean for publishers in a practical sense? Number 5, is this new reality sustainable from a business perspective? And thirdly, what does this new model mean for society? It's hard to find a woman in a top position in a newsroom. Who's Kath Weiner? Editor-in-chief of The Guardian. But it is difficult finding ladies at the top. But ladies in the room, I look forward in 20 years' time to you being in those positions, and it'll be easier to find somebody that you can make a fake tweet about. So, A, what is Silicon Valley focused on? So any of you that focused on the F8 presentation by Mark Zuckerberg, this was a slide he put up. And it is pretty astonishing to see their roadmap for the next 10 years. And when you look at that roadmap, you really focus on connectivity, AI, and VR and AR. But this is what's also astonishing about Facebook, is what they own. And when you look at the numbers of people and where they are, when you add in Instagram and WhatsApp as well as Facebook, it is eye-watering how much control they have. And that's pretty clear, and they want to do more on those platforms to make them as powerful. But those 10-year roadmap positions, I had to find a man with a beard, because I was coming to Oregon. You have a lot of beards here, as well as big trees. But VR, there's sometimes when I want to be like, VR, it's just the sexy thing right now, but I'm not sure how it fits within journalism. But when you look at the money that Facebook and Google are investing into VR, you just can't ignore it. And you can't ignore it when you spend any time with small people who are growing up in an environment, whereas this is increasingly becoming the norm. So I think even though we can't dismiss it, we have to watch it, we have to think about the ethics of VR. But from a technology perspective, when Zuckerberg is saying VR is part of our 10-year plan, we are going in that direction, and that's just where we're heading. AI, obviously we like to think about AI as robots who are all going to kill us. But actually, when you hear an Eric Schmidt talk about, Google are really where it needs to be in terms of artificial intelligence because of the amount of knowledge and data they have because of their, what they've been collecting for all these last 20 years. But those of you who have Google Photos, the silly fact that it can recognize dogs, we're not hugely far along when it comes to AI, but we are moving in that direction, and we're just going to get smarter and smarter and smarter. And I think from a journalism perspective, when you think about the Panama Papers, the reason that there was so much incredible collaboration around the Panama Papers was because no single news organization could do that analysis itself, so they had to collaborate. But when I think about the possibilities of artificial intelligence, it's how could artificial intelligence have found the patterns and the trends that were surfaced by the Panama Papers, not putting journalists out of a job, but then saying journalists then go in and do the storytelling around that. But the opportunities that AI will provide journalists in terms of connecting the dots, I think is incredible. Facial recognition, I love this picture. Facial recognition does terrify me, and it's pretty much one of the most important things that Silicon Valley is now focused on. But the ability to be able to surface those connections and to look at images and say, yes, that's Claire, is terrifying when I think about whose hands it might end up in. But visual recognition, natural language processing has now come to a point where it's pretty good. And when it comes to visual recognition, we're not there, but that's really what Silicon Valley is focused on. And I think many of you may have followed the racist Twitter account of Tay, and this was an example of Microsoft just putting this out too early. But it did create useful conversations, I think, about artificial intelligence and made us start thinking about what the repercussions are around these things. And those of you who have downloaded CNN on Messenger, which again, I would recommend you do a lot of this just to see what's happening. In F8, when Zuckerberg said you can now build bots on Facebook Messenger, CNN were the first to launch. Now, if you follow CNN on Messenger, every morning it sends a really bad notification, like, hey, there's a lot going on in the world today. Click here for more information. No shit, CNN. There's always lots going on. And you can kind of have conversations a little bit with CNN, but it's not a bot in an artificial intelligence way. It's simply a mechanism for doing push notifications. But again, just keep watching all of this because it's going to get smarter and smarter. And whenever you read somebody say, oh, bots aren't what everybody says they're going to be, they will be. We're just not yet there yet. And I mentioned this when, who was here that I met in New York? I loved you. We had a great time. But I talked about this here. So Kik is a messenger app that many people my age have not heard of, but 40% of American teenagers have it downloaded on their phone. Kik has 200 engineers in Silicon Valley simply to create news bots that will deliver personalized news to you at the time of day that the bot knows that you're in a position to read that news in a language with the right emojis that will enable you to have a conversation with them about the news. When you think about that engineering talent at a messaging app that most of us haven't heard about, that's why newsrooms are struggling, because even the New York Times, when you look at their tech team, is tiny in comparison to the technology skills and talent that Silicon Valley has. And really, that for me is a kind of a testament to when you think about Silicon Valley and journalism, they are working on news solutions. Facebook's instant articles was because Facebook was annoyed that news organizations were not making the mobile experience better. And they said, if you're not going to do it, we're going to put 50 engineers in a room. And 3 months later, they built instant articles and said, there you are, news, sort it out. They're doing stuff in terms of ad tech that's really amazing because advertisers can't get their shit together. So when you think what's happening in Silicon Valley, it's about that engineering talent. And really, that's what newsrooms can't compete with, particularly while the news industry continues to be competitive with one another. Only when the news industry says, we need to start working together to build solutions, we need to start working together to come up with answers, will there be a way to balance out the relationship at the moment. Because at the moment, it's Silicon Valley and it's individual news organizations that still aren't talking to one another. Secondly, platforms as publishers, question mark. So when we had our Journalism in Silicon Valley conference back in November 2015, we put up this slide to say 2015 was the year that these platforms that had previously simply called themselves communication platforms clearly moved into the news ecosystem. From Snapchat launching Discover all the way through to Google and Twitter launching or announcing that they were going to launch AMP, Twitter News, Google News Lab, Instant Articles. It was very clear that 2015 was the year that that shift happened. This is what's happened in the last 6 months. These shifts, they keep happening. They're happening every week. And I think that the main shift here is now it's non-negotiable that when these platforms make a move, newsrooms aren't sitting back saying, should we play? It's just, we have to play. So Facebook says, we're going to privilege Facebook Live videos in our algorithm, and newsrooms go, OK, we'll do more Facebook Live. So these shifts are having a huge impact on newsrooms on a day-to-day basis. And at the Tau Centre, we are simply trying to keep track of all of this, because historians will look back and go, holy cow, what happened in 2015 and 2016? So every single day we have another line in Excel that says, this is what's happened today. And it's pretty astonishing the speed at which all of this is happening. So I think at the moment, I would struggle to say that these platforms are publishers. For me, they are making curatorial decisions, which in itself is editorial. So I think they are making editorial decisions, and that's an important distinction. They are yet to be making original content. But let's look at Netflix. Netflix started simply as a platform, wasn't interested in making their own content. Now they are, and it's very, very successful. So I think if we don't think about the possibility that these platforms themselves move into the news space as publishers, we have a problem. And if you think about around big emergencies, do you remember around Haiti when Google created the People Finder? Facebook now has its alert system. When you think about you have a mobile phone, if you follow 6 news apps, you get 6 alerts that the president is in Hanoi. Actually, there's going to be a point when people say, I don't want to follow 6 news. I just want Facebook to tell me what's happening. And that's what we don't know enough about, which is how do audiences feel about this. We've had a little bit around the trends algorithm discussion the last 2 weeks, but this isn't the audience discussing this. This is editors at the New York Times writing think pieces about whether this is a problem. We don't know whether my mum would be upset whether Facebook told her the news, and that's what we need to do more research about. So this big hoo-ha, technical term, around trends, trending, and Facebook, I mean, for me, there's a great piece by Jim Ruttenberg yesterday from the New York Times saying, Zuckerberg knows everything about me. I give all my information to Facebook. This is Jim Ruttenberg talking, but many of us are the same. There's nothing I can hide from Facebook. But when people went to Facebook 2 weeks ago and said, are these Gizmodo rumors true? Do you have curators in a basement? Do you have guidelines? Nothing. Shut the door, and journalists refuse to answer any of the questions. And Jim Ruttenberg's idea is, hang on, when are we going to actually recognize that you've got a lot of information about us? How can we have more? And it was only when The Guardian got these leaked review guidelines that we really understood the scale at which they are making editorial decisions and what are their decision trees based on what they should show, what shouldn't they show, how do they write headlines, how do they frame stories. And we're going to get back to this towards the end of the presentation, but this, for me, has surfaced really interesting conversations about algorithms in general and made people think about algorithms in a way that up until now I don't think we had those conversations. So for me, it's more than simply the trending hoo-ha. So thirdly, this startling shift in audience behavior has happened in a very, very short space of time. And the other thing is, when we try and understand audience behavior, Damien's right, the Pew Center just released this report yesterday. If I try and do research about audience behavior, I have to ask you, how many times do you check Facebook a day? What would you say? 25. If I put a tracker on your phone, do you think it would say 25? More. Yeah. So the difficulty of understanding audience behavior is that we're very bad at understanding what we do ourselves. But if you think about Silicon Valley, they know everything about us, from where we are to what we're buying to what music we're listening to. Even though WhatsApp is encrypted, they know the people that I'm having the most conversations with. They might not know what I'm saying, but they know who my closest relationships are with. So in terms of audience behavior, they know more than the news industry will ever know. And the news industry is having to rely on the platforms to give them data, and they're not giving them very good data. So there's a huge imbalance there when we think about audience behavior. But this is the biggest shift. What was the year that the first iPhone shipped? 2007. But yeah, I mean, it's quite astonishing to think of now we're so reliant on our smartphones. It's still in a very short space of time. And if I had my way, this slide would just have said mobile, 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 mobile. I mean, the shift has been so vast. And this was actually, yesterday I spoke to some of your faculty, and I hadn't read this article, which is from the Washington Post yesterday, which is a great piece about what it's like to be 13 and completely just addicted, I think there's no other word to say, to your smartphone and living your entire friendship circle out online that actually don't play with each other very much, but they're chatting constantly with each other. And the point we were discussing yesterday is, what will it be like to teach journalism students in 5 years' time when all they've ever known are chat apps and messaging apps? It's a very different student than the students that I'm looking at right now. And this was the Pew Center research yesterday. Look at my little laser, if only there was a cat here. But these lasers, we often don't think about Reddit as a platform, but Reddit is fascinating in terms of growth in use of social media for news. So the question is % of users of each social networking site who gets news where. So on Reddit, it's now 70% of users on Reddit say that they find news there. Facebook, 66. But compared to 2013, it's gone up from 47. The more interesting question for me is, how many people are going to Facebook to find news versus them bumping into it? And what we don't know is, for example, when Prince dies, do I find out because Damien just posts RIP Prince on Facebook, or is it because Damien shares a BBC News article, or is it because I follow BBC and get it? That level of granularity we know very little about because we can't get access to these platforms to really understand. So while this is a kind of a useful set of data, I want to know so much more than simply who stumbles into news. Because if this says 66%, who is on Facebook who and never sees any news? Like, I just can't imagine what that feed looks like. So I think there's also that question. Yeah, I suppose, but you must, things get shared into your feed. Like, literally, you don't hear any news on Facebook. Anyway, so we just need much, much more research into that experience on these different platforms. And this is another slide that I showed to the students who were here a couple of weeks ago, which is from Mary Meeker, which is our desktop use is still pretty high. It's only gone down a little bit, but actually our mobile use is just growing. So we're actually receiving more information than ever before. We're almost doubling the time we're looking at screens. But the problem, again, news organisations are facing is nobody is delivering me news that says, right, at 7 o'clock she wakes up and therefore I'm going to deliver a piece of news that she just wants to read in bed because her eyes are half open. And then I'm going to deliver her news in a format because she's standing waiting for coffee, but she's still on her smartphone. When she gets into work at 9 and she's procrastinating, she's going to read something a little bit longer. But at lunchtime, she's out getting a sandwich, she's going to want something different. Then when she gets home, she's on her, that's what news organisations aren't doing, which is recognising how people want different packaged news at different times of day on different devices. And when we think about platforms, we cannot forget the huge spread of messaging apps, particularly in different parts of the world. So in South Korea, you've got Kakao Talk. Viber is huge in Burma. Line is massive in Japan, but increasingly becoming big in America. Messaging apps really are the next frontier. And a lot of news organizations really haven't got their head around how do you deliver news on a messaging app? How does that look? What are people's expectations? But we are seeing people's behavior moving from fewer people want to post on Twitter and Facebook because they're worried about sharing it with everybody. They are moving into WhatsApp groups and messenger groups and spaces that feel safer. But the other part of this puzzle is not just where people are, it's how these platforms are transferring news. So when you think about referral sources, Facebook and Google are the two huge players here. Snapchat and Instagram, there's no way to link on Snapchat and Instagram out. On Instagram, you can change a link in the profile, but you'd have to change it every time you have a new story. So the different role of these different sites in terms of sending traffic back to the homepage is really important. And I'll get to in a second how this intersects with business models. So if you're the Wall Street Journal and you've got a paywall, how do you play on which sites versus BBC, which is, non-profit or a license fee? And all of this means, this is from the New York Times Innovation Report, in 2014 people had to wake up to the fact that traffic to the homepage is really significantly dropping. Now, if you're a big brand like the New York Times or the BBC, you still have relatively good homepage traffic because of brand awareness. But for any other site, it's almost all coming from social. So that has been a massive shift in a very, very small space of time. But ultimately, we have to remember that we know more now about the audience than we did before. It used to be that you'd get newsstand numbers which said how many people bought this newspaper today. But you don't know if that just went home and was used to line the kitty litter tray, or whether people just skipped through it and just read the cartoons. We've never really had very useful data. We now have much, much better data from things like Chartbeat, which has allowed newsrooms to understand this new reality. But then how do these, when fewer people are coming to your own site, and they're reading an instant article, you have to rely on Facebook's metrics. So now publishers who are used to a much, much more sophisticated context in terms of metrics are now go back to Snapchat doesn't give us anything, and it's horrible. So metrics on these different platforms are fascinating. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening in Silicon Valley. This is what they're up to. What does this mean to publishers? So we've spoken to 70 of them, and this kind of sums up how they feel, which is, ooh, people really do not know what to do for the best. It's all about, we can't run away, because if we run away, this could be that moment in history where you have to be here. But if we go all in, are we screwing our business model, and is this the end of us because we stupidly got excited about Facebook? So there is real trauma, and in fact, the journalists that we spoke to, we'd say, have you got 10 minutes for an interview? We'd be on the phone to them for over an hour. It was like a therapy session, but it was all confidential because it's academic research. And they were like, can I just tell you? And all this stuff was coming out from these people saying, we don't know what to do for the best. And hearing all-out wars within newsrooms, half the newsroom saying, we're in a moment of revolution, we have to shift on a day-to-day basis, we have to be where the new technology is driving, and half the newsroom saying, no, we're shooting ourselves in the head, this is insane. And these poor social media managers in the middle saying, I can't sleep at night because I don't know what's best for my newsroom. And this is the BuzzFeed model. They put this out last month. You probably saw it, which is 80% of BuzzFeed's reach exists beyond their website. So anybody who's been to BuzzFeed's website knows it is horrible. Looks like somebody's vomited on the page. The reason is because I actually sat in a focus group when somebody goes, BuzzFeed, yeah, it's that Facebook news site. Like, this guy had no idea that it existed as a standalone news site. But when you look at where they are on social networks, on messaging apps, on video syndication partners, curators and partners, and their own apps, it's a quite incredible, well, just a logistical nightmare to keep track of all of this. They've come up with new metrics involving social lift. They're doing incredibly interesting things around sponsored content. They in themselves are a fascinating case study of a news site that emerged in this ecosystem. But how are they funded? Yes, a lot of VC money, venture capital money. So if you come from a news site that just has to rely on advertising, you look at BuzzFeed and go, how can you do that? But because BuzzFeed, at the moment have money coming in from VCs, they're in a different space to innovate. So we at the Tau Center decided that if BuzzFeed were doing that, what were the other brands doing? So this is top secret research that's not being launched until the 21st of June. So please don't tweet this. Damien, put your phone down. But we basically looked at 9 publishers, and we looked to see whether they had a presence on Apple News, Instant Articles, Snapchat, Facebook, blah, blah. Does anybody know what this is? Oh, hello, yes, the List app. It's like this random app that I still don't know what the purpose is, but weirdly, some publishers are on the List app. Anyway, so this is a little bit green, Oregonian green, but this is essentially all these publishers on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you can see of the 20 different potential platforms, which ones are they on? And you can see the likes of Wall Street Journal on 17 out of 20 of those platforms, Fox News, 14 out of 20, CNN, 16 out of 20. So there's a lot of these quite traditional platforms that are, publishers who are on these different platforms. So this is not just BuzzFeed. That's lots of different people are doing it. And so this is what it makes people feel like. I do this because I hate cats. And there's way too many cats on the internet, so my slides always got lots of dogs in. But people are just exhausted, because how do you resource this? It's terrifying how you resource this, and it's very, very difficult. But there's this feeling of we can't not do it, because what if we miss out? And here's an example from Vox, and I know you had somebody from Vox in. But here's an example of a story they did about the 29th of February. 2 years ago, social media managers were simply taking links from the news website and posting those links on all the different platforms. Now they recognize you have to create unique content for the different platforms, because the different platforms have different algorithms. The different platforms have different ways that they expect you to create content for them. So here's what it looked, the same story on Snapchat, the List app, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as on the Vox website. Here's another case from the Wall Street Journal, same, Snapchat, the Wall Street Journal app, the List app, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Apple News, and the Wall Street Journal. It is eye-boggling when you actually start looking at individual case studies of stories and how they get repackaged and the size of these teams and what they need to be doing. And that's something that's come through a lot in our interviews, is this question of scale. So this is a long quote, but it's essentially people saying some platforms demand heavier lifting, which big or well-financed publishers are better equipped to handle than smaller ones. Snapchat requires its own publishing teams. Lots of smaller platforms are publishers like, are you crazy? This is the actual quote. When they hear of the resources deployed, they say, can't even. But that's the point. How do you, if you're a Boston Globe, resource this? You just can't. So all of these publishers we just showed you are the big guys. This is not representative of the news industry in general, and there's something about the big versus the small that's really important. But here's Wall Street Journal, which you wouldn't necessarily think would be an obvious publisher for Discover. They actually are doing a lot of stories about entrepreneurship. They've got a pretty healthy diet or audience of kind of early 20s who are interested in business. That they know that those people are not Wall Street Journal subscribers yet. But the purpose of being on Snapchat is the hope that they will take those people and they will transfer them into Wall Street Journal subscribers. This is the Times. So how much money are Facebook giving to a certain group of publishers to create Facebook Live content? For 20 posts. 250,000 for 20 posts. Which, if you're the Times, it's kind of a drop in the ocean. But the Times has gone all in with Facebook Live, mostly because they recognize that they've been seen as behind the curve when it comes to innovation. So they're putting some of their best, who's this journalist? Nick Kristof. Some of their best investigative journalists, the likes of Nick Kristof, having an interview with Caitlin Jenner. But it's a very, for them, they say we have to be in this space because otherwise we might look back and regret it. But resourcing-wise, the Times can do that. They're not doing it for the money, they're doing it for prestige. And this is a great story of a very young producer who's at CNN, who in her interview wowed the interview panel because she knew more about every messaging app than anybody they'd ever met. So they hired her, and she's now the social apps producer for CNN, doing all sorts of really innovative things. But CNN has over 40 staff who are simply creating content for other platforms. So for a CNN, which you wouldn't necessarily think as the most digitally innovative, they're playing a huge part now in trying to change that perception. And the amount of content they put on these other channels is astonishing. And then BBC News take these platforms very seriously, but from a news gathering perspective. This is content that they got around the shooting on a Tunisian beach resort earlier last year because they advertise their WhatsApp number. So people send content directly to the BBC. This is Yik Yak, where they've been doing news gathering, asking people to send in anonymous experiences around mental health, and then feeding that back into their coverage. And what the BBC says is by being in these spaces and doing news gathering, it means when they push stories out, they've got a bigger audience. So they're very much saying we cannot see this as simply distribution, it's also about news gathering. So in all these conversations we're having people, what are the major challenges that people are facing? The first one, as I said, is metrics. Apples do not mean apples. So a video view on Facebook is different to a video view on YouTube. When you're trying to work with advertisers, you don't have standardized metrics. This is creating huge problems for the publishers. And they keep saying to the platforms, you need to give us better metrics, and it's not happening. And in fact, we heard quite a number of publishers say, we should get into a collective bargaining situation where we say to Facebook, we will not put any content onto Facebook for a week until you improve your metrics, or at least explain to us what these metrics mean, because we're completely stuck because we can't use your metrics, they're dreadful. But all we can do is say to our bosses and our advertisers, this is what Insight says, but we don't really know who these people are, et cetera, et cetera. Access is a huge problem. So some publishers will say, yeah, I talk to Twitter and Facebook 4 times a day. I don't do a big story before I've picked up the phone and I've spoken to a platform. Whereas other smaller publishers say, I honestly haven't even got an email for Facebook. I wouldn't even know where to start to get in contact with them. So when you think about what that means for smaller publishers, niche publishers, international publishers, there's a huge difference in terms of access. And the platforms are saying, we want to have a better, more transparent way of deciding who gets into our beta testing group, but it's not there yet. Archive is a huge, huge problem. So when I was working for UNHCR, we had people in the field creating content in, for example, Central African Republic. They would take little videos of refugees. They would then send it via WhatsApp to me in Geneva. I would know that Facebook wants native video, so then I would upload it directly to Facebook and it would go out on UNHCR's Facebook page. There will be a black hole of content that's nowhere in the UNHCR archive because all of this was happening on social platforms that had nothing to do with UNHCR. That is playing out across the board. So from an archive perspective, huge, huge problems about all this stuff is going up there. You know this. If you search in Facebook for a post, you can't find it. There's no good search functionality. We're losing all of this content. This is really interesting. I hadn't thought through. The moderation policies are really difficult. So, for example, Snapchat. I spoke to one publisher who said, I want to send 6 reporters out to do a live story at a political event. Only one of them can be on Snapchat at a time. So one of them has to go onto Snapchat and then log off, send a text to the next producer to say, now you can go onto Snapchat. Then they have to log off and then go to the next one. Snapchat wasn't built for this, so they haven't actually worked through what they should do. Similarly with Facebook Live, New York Times saying, we're trying to get all of our reporters to do Facebook Lives, which means we have to give access to our Facebook page to all of our producers. She said they're lovely people, but who knows, they're not going to get drunk one night and put something out on the New York Times page because they've got terrible moderation and security policies. So again, these platforms are dictating the space, but without any experience or knowledge of publishing risk or what journalists have to think about. And connectivity, another huge problem. You saw BuzzFeed trying to do that Facebook Live with Obama, and it just went down. Lots of publishers are saying to us, Facebook wants us to go out and do lives, so we'll go out onto the street and try and do something interesting, and the connectivity just isn't there. So we have to go back into the newsroom and do a, oh, hi, we're on Facebook Live, but in the newsroom. Like, we're trying to do all this stuff, and we can't because connectivity is such a problem. So what does all this mean in terms of business models? And I think sometimes we can have these conversations and forget the huge elephant in the room. So what's the advertising revenue model on instant articles? If I'm a publisher and I'm putting content into does everybody know what an instant article is? Yeah, so when you, on your feed, only on mobile, when you see this little lightning, it means it opens up very, very quickly, but it's sitting within Facebook. You're not being directed back to the page.
So Facebook sells the ad, they take 70% and they give you 30%. If you sell the ad, you keep 100%.
Yes, exactly. So if you are, again, a big enough publisher with inventory, then that's great. Again, if you're a smaller publisher and you don't have those relationships, it's much more difficult. Apple News. Apple News is so interesting. Lots of people are putting lots of content on there. But there's also real problems with metrics. But they have thought through, again, ways to think about advertising in innovative ways. Snapchat, making a big fuss about, if you advertise with us, it's vertical videos. There's no pre-roll ads. It's a beautiful experience. That's how people consume it. They've got very sexy decks about why you should advertise with Snapchat. Started off, originally, you'd have to pay $750,000 to get into Snapchat Discover. Those numbers have come right down now to about $250,000. It's now 2 cents per view. Fascinating to understand all of this. But up until now, publishers have been able to control that. Snapchat now look like they're going to start trying to sell ads across different Snapchat Discover channels. It's very, very interesting. And again, often these conversations aren't being had, but this is what's so crucial. If people are putting all of their content on these platforms, how are they going to make money? Because Snapchat Discover ads are temporary, non-targeted, and non-measurable. So they managed to convince people to spend $750,000 by saying, we're the next crazy new thing. Millennials have got all the money. That's where you need to be. But in comparison to previously, where you had to give really good metrics back to advertisers, Snapchat's getting away with murder. So thinking about the different business models that we have, you see very different practices on these platforms, and that for me is what's really interesting. And as we said, BuzzFeed and Vox, these big publishers that are basically funded by VC, again, different ways of thinking about these platforms, and they're very much all in. So I love this slide, and the other day in New York, I saw a woman basically walking 2 dogs like this. I was like, I thought that was a joke, but no, it really is. So when scale is your goal, basically, the bottom has fallen out of mobile advertising. Like, just the numbers. Even there was a great piece today about how in the UK, the newspaper market has just fallen off a cliff. Just advertisers do not want to publish in newspapers anymore. People would say to us, we've got little choice than to go all in. We can't drive traffic back to our site. If we do, we're not getting any money for advertising. We have to just hope that we can make money off these platforms. So here's an example. This was a content study. Again, this is secret. Of CNN, where did they publish for a week in May? So in total, in 1 week, they put 2,448 things out on different platforms. So 1,169 was on Apple News. Easy peasy, you plug it into your RSS feed and it just goes. But here, 251 Facebook posts driving traffic back to CNN, 93 instant articles where they're trying to make money within the article, 17 Instagram posts, 25 Messenger updates, 71 Snapchat Discover stories, 574 tweets, 248 YouTube videos. So that's a lot of content that CNN are pushing out on their different sites. This is Washington Post. Similarly, scale. 1,000 Apple News stories, 34 Facebook posts driving traffic back to Washington Post, 224 instant articles. So Washington Post are the one publisher who've said, Jeff Bezos, obviously, got big pockets. We're just going to try and put as much as we can into instant articles to test, see if we can make money. 15 Instagram posts, 84 Snapchat Discover stories, 871 tweets, 3 YouTube videos. Again, remember, look at the difference between a TV channel versus a news site. Not very good at video. When you have a paywall, so Wall Street Journal, very different. Not interested in Apple News, because they're Wall Street Journal, and they've got their paywall. 349 Facebook posts. So interestingly, if you like Wall Street Journal on Facebook, you can go via Facebook straight into Wall Street Journal. 1,021 tweets. You cannot go from Twitter straight into Wall Street Journal. It asks you to log in or subscribe. 107 YouTube videos, 23 line messages, 1 list app, 11 Facebook instant articles. So you're seeing very different behavior on different platforms depending on business model. And when you have to justify the money you're given, it's what people say. I can't justify putting 6 reporters onto a Snapchat story to create content for someone else's platform that will disappear after 24 hours. Like if you're the BBC, there's no way I'm going to be able to justify that to the license fee payers. Another one saying, our brand is everything to us. When we're on other platforms, we have to ensure that the audience knows that they're watching a video created by us. We have to show impact. So there's real fear, which is in your newsfeed. How do people know whether it's AJ+, BBC, Sky, whatever? You know if it's an AJ+ video, as you know, because AJ+ branding is everywhere. And finally, what does all this mean for society? And this is, I think, from an academic perspective, what we really need to be thinking about and these different issues. And so this first one, as I mentioned, the trending question. This is what Facebook replied after the Guardian piece. We will also keep looking into any questions about trending topics to ensure that people are matched with the stories that are predicted to be the most interesting to them, and to be sure that our methods are as neutral and as effective as possible. The problem with this is Zeynep Sufeki from the University of North Carolina, who's very, very smart on this, pointing out Facebook feed algorithm sold as what you want, but it structures the experience. Facebook trending is sold as an algorithm, but it's Facebook's preferences. They need you on the site for as long as possible so they can sell ads around you. So as much as they say it's neutral, no algorithm is neutral. Every algorithm is programmed by a person. Every person has inherent bias. As journalists have always had inherent bias, which is the struggle around objectivity and impartiality, but now we're seeing the same conversations emerge around algorithms. And this is just great from Zeynep. I just want to read this. If a bridge sways and falls, we can diagnose that as a failure, fault the engineering, and try to do better next time. If Google shows you these 11 results instead of those 11, or if a hiring algorithm puts this person's resume at the top of a file and not that one, who is to definitively say what is correct and what is wrong? Without laws of nature to anchor them, algorithms used in such subjective decision-making can never be truly neutral, objective, or scientific. And what's particularly interesting is if you talk to Google and Facebook about why can't you be more transparent about your algorithms, they'll say, honestly, our algorithms have been built upon and built upon and built upon and built upon. We couldn't actually explain now how it works. Because over the last 10 years, there have been incremental changes built by different engineers. We don't have one algorithm that we can explain to you. So there's these enormous numbers of moving parts, and they're interacting with the world, and they're learning and reacting. Now there used to be an algorithm called EdgeRank for Facebook, which was very clear. Now, in real time, they're deciding, depending on what you click on, who your friends are, what you've liked previously, what your friends like, in real time they're serving up content to you. There's not one algorithm, it's personalized to you. And it's learning and becoming smarter about what you like. So there isn't one algorithm because there's one algorithm for everybody, essentially. And that's what's kind of terrifying. And the filter bubble, which you've heard lots about. But that, for me, they argue that actually you're seeing more content from different people now because we've all got a crazy Uncle Bob. Now, the problem with Crazy Uncle Bob, who just tweet or posts about Trump, is that you hide him. How many people here has hidden somebody from Facebook because of views that you didn't like to hear? Yes. So Facebook's argument is actually we now see a bigger range of content because we're friends with not just people that we went to university with, friends we went to high school with, who now we're like, that person is insane. So the argument is you're actually seeing this big range, but really we do then personalize more by hiding people. And did everybody see this on the Wall Street Journal, which was the conservative view of Facebook versus the liberal view? If you haven't seen it, you really should take a look at it because it is terrifying to see on any topic. You can see Hillary or Trump or abortion or climate change, and you suddenly see what the other side sees, depending on wherever you sit. I'm suspecting because I'm in Oregon, it's probably more on this side. But it's fascinating to see another reality, and often we don't get to see that. And you see that and think, yeah, there's more of a filter bubble. And this is something that I think we're going to hear more about. So my boss, Emily Bell, has got a 15-year-old son, and she was talking to him about BuzzFeed, and he's kind of like a 15-year-old boy who was like, oh, BuzzFeed's all cats and Kim Kardashian. I would never look at BuzzFeed. And she said, well, no, they have some really good investigative journalism now. You should really read it. He was like, I'm never served that because Facebook thinks he's a 15-year-old boy and doesn't think he would be interested in investigative journalism. So we don't hear a lot about demographic bubbles, but as they start understanding more about us and start thinking, okay, we're going to personalize based on people's demographic traits, I think that's much more concerning. We need much more transparency about moderation policies. As these sites are making decisions about what's up there and what's not up there, we need to know how that works. So this is Facebook's only part of their moderation policies. And they're very clear about we're trying to ensure that everybody's experience is the same. But if you click on the nudity, I sort of love that somebody has this job. We remove photographs of people displaying genitals or focusing on fully exposed buttocks. And I love that like a lawyer would have gone through all of this. But they're very clear about breastfeeding and saying, no, actually, we don't allow nipples, but if it's a breastfeeding nipple, we do allow that. The problem with most of this moderation is that it's done by computers now. They are algorithms who say that's a nipple. Then somebody has to say, no, but it's a breastfeeding nipple, and they're hoping that the machines will get smarter. But when we've got moderation that's based on machines, again, if we don't understand what those algorithms, how they work, it's concerning as well. And when it comes to graphic imagery, when it comes to hate speech, now if our default provider of news is something that we don't know what their policies are, it's a real concern for society. And don't worry, we're getting towards the end, but I had to say this because Damien loves local news. But yesterday I just Googled local school board live blog. And here's the Arkansas Times that was live blogging in March. What happens to this in Facebook? It's unlikely that they're going to think enough people care about this to show it into their news feed. So how does this very, very important role of journalism work in a context where it's rare that people will always be clicking on live blogs of school decisions so that the algorithm goes, oh, Claire loves live blogs of school decisions. And that, for me, is a massive, massive worry. And archive, which I lose sleep over at night, whether it's our personalized archive, I mean, most of you on Snapchat, you haven't got an archive anyway, but Snapchat has your archive. So that's the other issue, is that this is sitting on their servers, and we can't get access to them. And finally, are we ready for the new ethical challenges these technologies present? So this was Mike last week that did a live HIV test. I am pretty convinced that that was not a live HIV test, and he actually had done this before to see whether or not he was HIV before they did a live. This is an editorial meeting for the New York Times, and there was Gorka wrote a great piece, like, how do you have an editorial meeting when things haven't been fact-checked yet? Your lawyers haven't heard what you're saying, yet the New York Times is saying all this publicly. It then transpired that actually they had practiced all of this, and the stories then came out 2 hours later. I'm pretty convinced that the watermelon was also rehearsed. So we've got a new ethics around live that we're not really discussing. And so every time we have this new technology, how do we learn? Somebody committed suicide on Periscope. We are within months of ISIS beheading somebody on Facebook Live. There are huge ethical dimensions around live that we haven't got our heads around yet. AR or VR, this is the work of Dan Archer, who I really respect, is one of our fellows. But I said to him, were the clouds like that? Was that the weather on that day? The witnesses that you used, did you actually have the voices of those witnesses, or are they actors? We haven't yet had proper conversations about the ethics of that. And does anybody know what Banjo is? So they're trying to build a crystal ball. they essentially use satellite imagery and cross-reference with social media uploads and say, well, there shouldn't be smoke coming from the University of Oregon, so clearly something has happened. It's getting very, very sophisticated. It also uses artificial intelligence to hear dialects to say that should be in this part of France, that building and that architecture is this part of Paris. Very, very smart. But I don't really want this falling into the hands, I mean, we know Secret Service has more sophisticated stuff, but they are being sold private CCTV data. There's all sorts of stuff now that we're getting closer and closer to Minority Report. So those people who are data scientists, there's a huge need now for people who are being taught data science to be taught ethics. Very smart people who believe entirely that technology is the savior of all. Actually, we need them to understand that they are building very, very powerful constructs, and they need to understand what the impact on society is. And if you are interested in any of these ethical issues, ONA has a build your own ethics code, and they've built them for automated journalism, robot journalism, VR, user-generated content. It's a really great resource as they try and work through these different ethical challenges. So finally, so that we don't all get really depressed, we live in very, very, very exciting times, but we've got to be on guard. Watchdog. And these are 6 things that I really believe in. We need, A, more transparency from the platforms. They cannot get away with saying, we can't tell you this because it's our secret source. It's not in our interest to tell you. If they're going to be part of the public sphere and civil society, they have to be part of these conversations. Secondly, more collaboration within and between the news industry. It is ridiculous that we're still competitive and don't want to talk to each other. The only way to actually play in this space is by working together. Of course, I'm going to say this because I'm a research director, but we need to understand more about this subject, and we need to have more access to more data. Because, again, the social networks make it very difficult for academics to access data. Fourth, better technology criticism in our journalism. So there has been some really good articles in the last couple of weeks, but most technology criticism in the press is either, oh my God, there's a new Apple device, isn't it amazing? Or the robots are going to kill us. And that is actually not very much in between. And when it comes to this space, we need journalists who can actually understand algorithms, understand how this works, and explain it to a population that doesn't necessarily understand it, yet it's shaping everything that they do. Better ethical training for data science programs, and more algorithmic education in schools. And I think this is going to shift, but if we don't stop and say, we're living in really important times, and we have to get together and start thinking about what this is going to happen, it's not going away. These companies are not going to become less powerful, and we have to stop being like, oh, it's unfair, and just say, okay, this is a new reality, and how do we make sure it works? But I will do a real tweet, but this is a fake tweet I did last night, to say, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
You talked about transparency in the new social media in terms of news. Are current social media less transparent in their news gathering and dissemination than legacy medias have been? It's not like we've known a hell of a lot about how most legacy news have decided and what their biases are. I mean, they've always said, we're objective, believe us.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because I felt when they were forced to put out these trending guidelines, and the newspapers were like, this is, you know, why haven't we seen these before? It's like the New York Times has never told me why they put Egypt on the front cover and not, you know, Yemen. So I agree with you entirely. I think the transparency around algorithms, and while I understand that, but I think particularly the news feed, trending, yes, we've always had decisions made about that, but deciding why I see something, and I think also the education piece, lots of users, my mum included, doesn't understand that she doesn't see everything that she's ever liked on Facebook. You know, so I think for me that transparency is they don't make that clear to their users.
You had a fairly positive comment about the potential for artificial intelligence. I'm trying to think of what a publisher would think of artificial intelligence, and probably think of it as a way to get rid of staff.
Yeah.
Any comment on that?
Yeah, so the Associated Press has been the first news organisation to really take automated journalism seriously, and they've had a lot of criticism from people saying, like, haven't you had to lay off staff? Well, A, they've actually created a new role in terms of an automation editor, but their position is that in the next 5 to 7 years, 95% of what the AP puts out will be automated, but the numbers will be huge in comparison to what they're putting out now. Their argument is, and of course we should remain sceptical, is that there's a lot of jobs that journalists do right now that's pretty mundane. And actually, if artificial intelligence can mean that we can do better analysis of patterns. We can do better digging into data that right now powerful people are getting away with murder because we don't have the human brain power to analyze. But it means that then journalists sit on top and do better journalism. I do believe that that's the case, but we'll have to see. But yeah, people just doing financial reports, nobody should have to do that. That should be a robot that does it. But I want more journalists doing interesting things about the connections.
Isn't this all a great argument for public knowledge policy and public supporting production of public knowledge and distribution of public knowledge and the creation of public spaces for knowledge sharing?
Yes, all of that. If you spend any time at the BBC, they are kicking themselves that they didn't try and create a social network kind of 10 years ago. They had the resources, they had the knowledge, and they had the trust to do something like that. They didn't, and as a result, it would be very difficult now to create a platform that audiences were like, oh, I'm just going to leave Facebook and I'm going to go to this space that's more trustworthy. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, but I completely agree. I think the fact that these commercial companies, and the reason that they don't have to be transparent is they can say, we can't give away that information because we're commercial entities who have to remain our retain competitive.
Efforts to, by individual nations or areas of the world, like the European Union, to essentially say, we have issues, concerns, and priorities in our culture, and Facebook, if you're going to operate here, you have to abide by these parameters.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to look at these conversations in Europe versus the US. And of course, in Europe, we're much bigger fans of regulation. So the way that Europeans talk about these technology companies is completely different. And there have been a number of attempts to say to the big social platforms, you can't do this, you have to give up this data. I mean, I think this idea of these subjects are important, you need to push them, is also, there's problems to that too. But I just wish we had a space that wasn't owned by a commercial entity where there was the opportunity to have a public sphere. But I don't know how we get there. And I'm also sad that the BBC didn't try and build something because they also have a worldwide reach. But yeah, I don't know. But the European conversation is fascinating.
It just seems like what you've described here is the public sector, in which you kind of described as the news industries, which I wouldn't agree equals the public sector. But the news industries are chasing after these developments in a way that there's no way they will ever catch up or get close. And so pretty much what's going to happen, according to this scenario, is the responsibilities for creating so-called public knowledge for a democratic society is going to now rest entirely within the hands of corporations.
Yes. No, and this rise has happened at exactly the same time as the advertising model has fallen out of the publication space. So it's hard to kind of disentangle the two. If we'd had a really thriving news industry where advertising was really still paying the big bucks as it was even 15 years ago, would this be happening? Would we be having this all-in policy? I think the level of how terrified people are is kind of inversely proportionate to how much they're going all in. So I think, again, if you talk to a BBC about this, they have very different views about whether they should be going all in, because they don't have to, because they still have the license fee. So you see a difference when you talk to different people who have different funding models. But yeah, it makes me very sad. I wish there was a stronger public media in the US.
Maybe BBC could have come up with a social network, but I remember hearing Marty Barron talk a number of years ago saying that there's no way that they would have been allowed to create a social network because it would have cost too much money and their boards would have kicked them all out. So I mean, I think there's a little bit of a, kind of a, I don't know, sort of a sense among people that, well, you guys dropped the ball, you missed the boat, but from a business perspective, they couldn't. That was his perspective.
The Washington Post or the BBC?
The what? Sorry?
Sorry, the Washington Post couldn't have done it, or the BBC couldn't
The Washington
have done it.
Post.
Oh yeah, no, I agree, because from a commercial perspective, you couldn't go to your board to say, we're creating a space that potentially people might come and have conversations on. And it's also problematic, there's a lot of people who hate the BBC, so the idea that the BBC would have been the saviour also wouldn't really work for people who don't trust the BBC, so, yeah.
Editor for BBC World Service and World News, and say news organisations are so scared of missing out that they sometimes forget the value and the cachet they bring to these platforms.
Yeah.
that they're bringing great content and respectability to these networks, but they are sometimes prepared to, in effect, sell their soul to get on there because they don't want to miss out and miss the boat, and therefore undervalue what they're bringing to the platform. So they actually have a really strong negotiating position, particularly with emerging networks, and they usually fail to take advantage of that.
So if you think about Facebook Live, we know about it because you have to hold up a phone and press live. If you're a big broadcaster, you can push video through to live via an API. So if you're CNN or BBC, you take your HD quality video, you push it through. It's not live. You sent your chopper up to do your weather forecast. You send it through. That's not live video. But then from then, they're like, why on earth are we putting our really good TV onto a little screen for people to consume? We're broadcasters. Why are we doing this? So I think you're absolutely right there. From broadcasters in particular, they're like, why are we just giving our TV to Facebook to allow them to become another Netflix?
Is it fair to say that in terms of the content that people are consuming, whether through conventional media or their digital, evolving digital outlets or apps, Silicon Valley and so on, that there is an inexorable trend towards this personalization and away from the role of, say, a conventional editorial board deciding what's important and individually tailored to the user based on all of these analytics, and I take it that's unavoidable and so on. So are people talking about a potential downside of that? For example, one of the criticisms of Spotify, for example, if we'd had it in 1956, you would not have encountered Elvis, and you would not have encountered Bob Dylan, and you would not have encountered Jimi Hendrix or the Sex Pistols. It was too big a leap based on all of your analytics on this is what I like. Is that part of the conversation?
Yeah, I mean,
we may be losing something really bad. Not that editorial boards always got it right; they didn't. But there was something going on there besides based on these are the last 10 things I like. You're going to like number 11.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the music example is a really strong one because I think from a news perspective, I mean, this idea that the golden age, I used to buy The Guardian every day and I'd read it cover to cover, but I was not reading any other media outlet. I now consume amazing content from at least 25 different outlets. The stuff that I get sent via my feed, which is partly, it's the Facebook algorithm, but it's also my network. So if Damien shares something interesting, I get that. So on one hand, I feel like I get a better diet than I did 15 years ago. But I do also agree that the serendipity is that I don't get any right-wing news. I just don't. And to see that Wall Street Journal, I was like, oh, God, that's what they really say about Hillary. So I think that's like the Sex Pistols example is a great, I might use that later and credit you. But I think that's the example of the real outliers. I think it's not to say, oh, previously we got a better diet. I think we get a better diet now, but we don't get the serendipity. So, yeah.
Are you saying, so for example, Instagram recently changed their algorithm and it went from being a chronological feed, which I really liked, and now it's the more curated feed, and it's kind of lost its organic nature to me, and I don't use the app as much. Are you seeing any backlash from users when the change in algorithm happens and the content is just completely shifted?
I think what's interesting is it totally depends on people's individual network. So I don't follow particularly interesting people on Instagram, so I quite like the algorithmic change because I'm getting rid of the not so good. But I think people who'd really spent time curating a really good feed are angry. So I think that's part of the problem that the platforms have. They want to keep you on there for as long as possible. And as people grow and follow more people, the experience becomes, their idea, worse. And they will do anything in their power to keep you on there for as long as possible. But I think the complexity is that every user has a different relationship with every different app. So for some algorithms work and some people they don't. But more people like the algorithm.
Do you see it becoming algorithmically? Like if a person wanted to go back to chronological,
I don't understand why they don't do that.
Yeah,
because I hate the new algorithm on Twitter because I spent a lot of time curating my network on Twitter. So it doesn't work for me there, but it does on Instagram. So I don't know why you can't toggle. But these like Facebook, I was in a meeting recently with them, and they said we're 1% into what we will finally achieve. We're making huge mistakes because we're a young company. We're only 1% into what's possible. And when you hear them say that, you realize they don't really know what they're doing. You know, they're really well-meaning people, but these big questions about society, if they were in this room, they'd be nodding along as well, but they really believe that technology can help. And to be honest, we're seeing more conversations between them and, you know, publishers. Like, even 5 years ago, it was impossible to get them to a room. You are seeing more of those conversations, but they're well-meaning people who just don't even understand what they've built and aren't quite ready, you know they've got to make these changes. But I think we, academics, journalists, have got a really important role to play in helping them steer them through that path. Because publishers who've been working on publishing risk for a long time can say, I'll tell you about the ethics of live video and suicide, because we've had to have suicide guidelines, for example. You know, there's a really important role, I think, to help them shape some of their policies and guidelines.
Do you think additionally that, like, the phenomenon that is happening with Trump right now, where it's like, you know, the platforms, are they kind of responsible for feeding into that growth and
For me, it's the media. The media have massively screwed up, and so the media is being amplified by the platforms. But if they hadn't had the raw materials, Facebook couldn't have created their own materials. It's because the news media has done a horrific job of covering Trump and keeps saying, whoops, sorry, we're getting it wrong. Then a week later he does something ridiculous and they all cover him again. So I don't think we can blame the platforms before we've really blamed the media. I think that's what historians will say.
For a lot longer, and stay around for a bit. Whenever I talk to Claire, I feel like I just plugged into Watson, the computer, and my kind of brain is momentarily fried with all these amazing things. So hopefully you will feel the same. Thanks again to Claire.